All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest today is Sarah Leary. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, this is going to be great. Sarah's done a lot of things. You probably know her best, though, for co-founding Nextdoor, which is a social network that you're actually probably on. When people have founded businesses, there's a sort of like, oh, I haven't heard of that. Then there's like I've heard of that, and Nextdoor's probably one that you're like, I'm on it every day. And she started out at Microsoft, was at ePinions, and then that became eBay. Spent time at Greylock, Benchmark. You're pretty fancy.
Well, I have certainly been blessed.
At Harvard before all of that. What were you doing as a kid that you got into Harvard? I assume you played lacrosse. You were on the East Coast, right?
Yes. Well, I think for me, it was education was a priority in our family. And actually, I come from a long line of entrepreneurs and small business owners. In fact, probably the most important of that was my grandmother. And so that was very unusual for a woman in the 1930s and 40s to be running a business. She was the CFO of a family business. And so I grew up thinking that was normal. And she just put a very clear goal out there to get a great education, create opportunities. And lucky for me, a little bit of hard work, and I was a pretty good lacrosse player, and bingo, I end up at Harvard, which was an awesome opportunity. So I'm forever grateful for Title IX and all the opportunities that it afforded a lot of women of my generation.
When I was growing up, that was not a thing on the East Coast. We'd all go back to school, I call it back east. I went to Northwestern, so if you grew up in San Diego, that's back east. Everyone else thinks that's the Midwest.
That's the Midwest to me, right?
Right. But there's all these guys from the East Coast that played this game and women, and we just sit. Now it's a thing out here on the West Coast.
Now it's big. It's been fun to see it just explode over the years. And I think for me, I played a lot of team sports growing up. I played soccer, I played basketball. And so lacrosse was the last sport that I actually took up. And for me, it was more about the team aspect than a particular sport. But it afforded me awesome opportunities to see the country and to get exposure and to get a great opportunity to go to an awesome institution like Harvard.
Yeah. So what were your parents? Were your parents entrepreneurs too? I mean, your grandmother was, but...
My dad worked for about 25 years at a very large company. And right around the time that I was going off to college, he came and told me that he was leaving to go start his own firm. And I remember he was very nervous about it. And I just didn't skip a beat. I was like, yeah, isn't that what everyone does?
Right.
And I remember him saying to me later on that the confidence and just my response to him helped propel him to say, okay, I'm going to take this shot and I'm going to do it. And so I grew up in a family where you wanted to be in a place where your hard work could translate into the impact that you could have. And so that was kind of ingrained in me at a very early age. And even though I started off at a great company like Microsoft, I felt like I wanted to go earlier and smaller from the get-go.
Yeah. What kind of business was your dad, an entrepreneur? And it wasn't a tech business, right? It was
Well, tech at the time. He was in the business of selling copier machines and fax machines, which, in the 70s was a big deal. But he was in sales. Yeah. And so I grew up around a table where you learned how to sell your ideas, your plans, and sell anything. And actually, that's really helpful for an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's funny. I've kind of come to see the world see entrepreneurs everywhere in the world. When you're in tech, you always think that that's like a software company. But of course, when you see these, particularly now with COVID, you see these restaurants and you're like every donut shop and every dry cleaner, that's some entrepreneur who went out and figured out how to advertise and figured out how to pay rent
and frankly risked a lot for their family to make that happen. And I don't think that it's by accident that you see a lot of immigrants. My grandmother was an immigrant, and so she was like, if you're going to create your way in this world, you got to take some risk. And so I like that idea that you're betting on yourself.
Yeah.
I think that that's what true entrepreneurs have, whether that's in technology, software, or as you mentioned, it's the restaurant or the corner store.
Yeah. How'd you end? So you're at Microsoft, fabulous, perfectly good career. How did you make the move? Once you're there, you're getting paid and you've got colleagues and you're building something. And at some point you've got to just jump out, of the airplane. How did you animate yourself toward like starting things?
Uh, it's a great question because I was fortunate enough to end up at Microsoft at really a golden time. So the early '90s, I was on the product team that launched the first version of Microsoft Office.
Mm.
And that was an all star team. It was a time when Microsoft was just taking off and went from being this software company that some people had heard of to a household name. I was fortunate enough to, for example, be on stage when we launched Office 95, with
Wow.
Bill Gates and Jay Leno. And
Wow.
and to do that at age 25 is awesome and magical. And it was a place where you were given a lot of responsibility early on because it wasn't like there were people who had 20 some odd years of experience in selling and building software. We were writing the script as we went along, and that was an amazing learning curve. It was awesome, but for me, I just found myself at times just standing there saying, "Well, wait a minute, this is Bill and Steve's company."
Right.
Right? Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And as great as that was, it felt like you were putting your heart and soul into something, and it just didn't feel like it was ever going to be mine, which it shouldn't have been. I
Right.
was one of the first 11,000 employees, and they did
Right.
an amazing job of making employees feel like they had impact and ownership, and you thought like an owner at that company. But I remember one day watching as someone made a pretty big mistake in the manufacturing of Windows 95. Actually, they
Yeah.
overproduced it. And we had to scrap almost $100 million worth of product.
Wow.
And I remember being in the room because we were up next to talk to Bill and others in the leadership team about some project, and watching and thinking, oh my God, I'm going to watch someone get fired here.
Yeah.
And that executive was not fired. And it was kind of written off as like, oh, that was a mistake. Let's keep moving. And I just remember thinking, that's not normal. Right.
Right.
And it just felt like it was a great place to be. But there was this idea, the address for Microsoft is One Microsoft Way. That's also a way of thinking, like there was one Microsoft way, and you were going to do things that were going to help Microsoft be successful, which
Right.
was fantastic. But I was still early in my career, and it felt like, frankly, if I did not get off the merry-go-round that, as you talked about, was very comfortable, you got to work on great things, that it would be hard to ever get off the merry-go-round. And so
Mm.
after about 5 years, I said, I'm going to leave. I actually left to go to business school. I had many people tell me that that was a crazy idea. That ended up being the January of 1997, which, when you look back, that was a pretty good time to get off the merry-go-round at Microsoft and go in a
Right.
different direction. But it had more to do with things that I wanted to do and me wanting to get back to the East Coast than it had to do with anything that Microsoft had done wrong. In fact, I'm super grateful to have had that experience, and I think it imprinted a lot in my professional DNA of how you think about building
Right.
teams, building products, launching them, the caliber of people you want to have around the table. And so I'm forever grateful to Microsoft for giving me that opportunity.
Do you think were they right, or were you right to go back to business school? Because I've heard that a lot. I went when I was really young. I went to Kellogg when I was like 23, and I don't regret it. But I don't know if I was 35 if it would have made sense. But what?
It's a toss up, and it's a really hard decision to do the calculus on. For me, I think it was helpful, but for someone who ended up back in technology early stage, I could make the argument that it actually would have been better for me to go start something right away instead of going to business school. That being said, I had an amazing time. I made great connections. And more importantly for me, I got to go home to Boston and be near family, which for me was priceless. And so it had more to do with where I was in my life than specific skills that I learned in business school.
Yeah, it's actually pretty impressive. I teach a class at Harvard every year, like a class, like a day, not a professor. And as I went recently, the students, at least with this class, which was a strategy class, like incredibly diverse, like all over the world, like women, like I've always made fun of Harvard having gone to Northwestern, but it's pretty impressive.
They've done a nice job in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years to not only update who's in the class, but also to change the curriculum. When I was there was barely anything for entrepreneurship and field study, and they've pretty dramatically changed that in the last dozen years. And as a result, it's fun for me now to go back. We do a case on Nextdoor each year, and now I'm helping out as a entrepreneur in residence because there's so many young people and students who are working on new ideas, and they're not just working on them with other business school students, they're working on things with undergrads in the engineering school. And so it's become a lot more innovative and really looking towards entrepreneurship, and whether that's in true startups or even through the entire life cycle of a company.
Yeah, it was funny. Everyone I would meet, and this, of course, would be who I would meet. I wouldn't be meeting the investment banker types, but they're all like, oh, yeah, I've got this company that I started and that company that I'm running and that thing that I did when I was in Brazil, when I was in high school. It's like amazing. But you come out back to, how do you get back to Silicon Valley then? Did you?
So I spent a year in Boston after business school working for Greylock. And the idea there was that Greylock saw most of the interesting technology companies that were coming about in Boston. And I was trying to stay in Boston for family reasons. And ultimately, I just realized that what was happening in Boston was pretty good, but it was amazing out in Silicon Valley. And this is the end of 1998, beginning of 1999, when things were just exploding. And I just wanted to be in the center of it all. I wanted to be as close to the fire as possible. And during that time, I would spend a lot of time flying across the country. And one of my business school classmates was a part of was probably the first employee at Opinions, and said, hey, you got to come meet these guys. I think you might find it interesting. And lo and behold, it was about 2 or 3 months before I actually pulled the ripcord and moved. But there's just some times in your life when you meet people and you see an idea and you're like, this is it. And so I was compelled to move across the country. And I think I cooled my feet for about 6 hours before I started working, and had a full sprint when what became the journey that was Opinions.
It's funny. That's what James Courier always says is like, you want to be in Rome, at that time. You don't want to be.
James. James is great.
You don't want to be off in like the country. You want to be in the center of the universe.
And I think for each industry, it's a little bit different, right? HBS calls these like centers of excellence, right? If you want to be in media and you want to be in entertainment, then being in Hollywood is the place to be. If you want to be in finance, you got to be in London or New York. And if you want to be in the center of tech and new startups, then Silicon Valley is the place to be. And it certainly was in 1999. Yep. I think it's diversified quite a bit since then, but it's still a center of gravity.
For sure. So you're in the mix with things, Opinions, you go on this journey. It's not what you end up even being most famous for. It's like Lin-Manuel did, In the Heights, and everyone said, well, you better enjoy it, kid, because this will never happen.
Well, I hope I'm still writing the story and it's not over yet. But I got very lucky in joining Opinions. It was one of those companies that had the zeitgeist. It was the first platform where anyone could write reviews about products and services. So UGC was not a common term that people understood, user-generated content, that is. And the idea of, does anyone care what someone else has to think? In fact, I remember a very famous tech reviewer from the Wall Street Journal with the first name of Walt asked us, is like, who wants to hear from the average schmo about a digital camera?
Yeah.
And it turns out that people were willing to read reviews from other folks that some they knew, but most they did not know.
Yeah.
And in large part because there are so many products and services out there that the professional reviewers can't cover them all.
Right.
And it turns out that as it's happened for centuries, but word of mouth recommendations is something that we're very comfortable with and familiar with. And Opinions really brought that online. And we learned a lot of hard lessons about how to build identity and trust and reputation. That was very much of the time. And it's been interesting to just see how that's matured over
Right.
the years.
Well, it's funny. There was that early concept that people wanted like reviews from your friends. And it turns out you don't really want reviews from your friends. If you're looking for a guitar, you want a review from people who understand guitars, not what your friend thinks about it.
It's nice if your friend can give you that information because you know their sensibility. So I think it's interesting when you get to like a hotel, when someone tells me what's the best hotel in Paris.
Right.
And when someone tells me something other than the George Sank, I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like you're looking for some budget
Right.
kind of criteria that might be a little bit different than me. And so we're very good as human beings of knowing that you ask your fancy friends if you want a fancy recommendation. And if you want a budget one, you ask them. And so I think one of the things that the internet has had to develop over time is how you build that online reputation and how do you match people with the right content at the right time from the right person. Yeah. And that has taken some years to work itself out.
Yeah. So you end up back at eBay. So now you're back at a big company again. Drat. How do you get back out into into starting fan base, which ultimately,
well, the journey of Opinions was an amazing one. That was a company that was launched with a 10-page article in the New York Times Magazine before we ever even had the product available. So it just kind of burst onto the scene, and it was like, 12 slides and $10 million. I mean, it was of the time. And that journey, we grew. And then as things kind of fell apart in 2001, we had to cut back and reduce the size of the team, went through 2 rounds of layoffs, got the team down to 31 employees. And it was a challenge. But we came out of that with a different business model. We merged with another company. We took that new company, shopping.com, public in October of 2004. And then eBay comes in and acquires the company in 2005. And I had gone on this incredible journey. And all of a sudden, I find myself at a big company again. And the folks at eBay were like, hey, this is eBay. It's a great company. I was like, totally get it. Great company. But I left Microsoft at December of 1996.
Right,
and so that's not the direction that I wanted to go in. And so after I helped with the integration of Opinions and shopping.com into eBay, I politely exited and took a little bit of time off. Actually unpacked the boxes from Boston that had been sitting there for 7 years and was lucky enough to actually get the opportunity to be an entrepreneur in residence at Benchmark. Yep. And Benchmark had been the lead investor in Opinions. And one of the co-founders of Opinions and I started talking about starting something, and we're fortunate enough to have a place to start the thinking. And out of that, we started Fanbase. And the whole idea of Fanbase was take the experience that we had in building online communities and direct it towards a particular community that we felt was underrepresented online, and that was the sports community. And I can go into a lot of detail about the Fanbase story, but it was definitely an exercise in learning what to do and what not to do.
Right. Well, and eventually what was the main thing that wasn't working about Fanbase? Like the sports guys, sports wasn't a big enough market, or it was?
I think that sports can be a big enough market. I think for us, we made a whole bunch of mistakes in terms of developing something really in a vacuum for almost 18 months. And then when we launched it, we actually had great initial response. But what we saw in fact, we got up to 15 million unique visitors a month. But what we saw in the data was that folks weren't sticking and engaging. They weren't deeply engaged. And so we tried for several months to try and fix that and address that. But if you don't get the seeds of a community right in the beginning, it becomes very difficult to fix it. And after about 6 months, we actually offered to give the money back to Bill Gurley, who was the lead investor in Fanbase. He said, "That's the easy way out. I'll give you 3 months to work on some new ideas. It doesn't have to be directly related to Fanbase, but why don't you guys take another crack at it?" And that was hard. It was very hard to step back and say, this isn't working, and confess to each other that we didn't think it was going to be the next ESPN. But I'm so glad that we did.
And what do you think of that now that you're a venture capital? Because that you hear about that move once in a while, and it's generally very prominent. You know, you have to be a pretty confident venture capitalist to do that. What do you make of that move? Like, hey, it's not working out. I'm not taking the money back. Sit in a room and figure out something new, like as a venture capitalist.
I think that it really speaks to what I have found as an investor, and certainly something that I heard over the years, is that you bet on people. And the ideas can change and it can morph, but the people that you're betting on is the most important decision. And I think in this case, Bill looked at the team and said, this is a team that's going to do something interesting. If I give them some time and space, they'll probably figure it out. And he had the benefit of having worked with us, since the early days of ePinion. So he had some perspective on that. And frankly, that was a shot of confidence. It also put a bunch of pressure on us to, come up with a bigger idea, a better idea.
So this is a true pivot, right? Not like what people call pivots now, which is like, oh, we're adding a feature. It's a pivot.
A pivot is a polite way to talk about it. We certainly didn't call it a pivot at the time. It felt more like a restart. And it's only in hindsight that I can talk about it with a smile on my face and describe it as, it sounds very graceful as a pivot. It didn't feel that way. In fact, we had the really hard moment of going to the team. And at the time we had 10 people working on it and explaining to them, we're going to go in a different direction. It's not exactly what you signed up for. But my co-founder, Nirav Tolia, was adamant in giving people the choice to leave, kind of get off the bus if you weren't up for it. And if you were, then great. In fact, we offered severance for folks that wanted to leave immediately and leave as, part as friends and support them in their transition. And then for the people that stayed, it said the future is uncertain, but if you want to go on this adventure with us, please do. And when we look back, we think about the founding of Nextdoor as having 7 co-founders. It's all the people who chose to stay with us during that pivot and to work on new ideas and bring them to fruition. And I think that's really important. You got to get the team as small as possible so you can be as nimble, and you want to make sure everyone's on board together.
Yeah. And so how did the Nextdoor idea, or the idea to actually do it, because I feel like that idea had been around for a while, and the knock on it was like, it's pretty hard. Like, it ain't like Facebook, it's kind of hard, and neighborhoods are hard. It's hard.
It's hard. Without a doubt. It was, we all knew it was going to be hard. And you're absolutely right. In fact, when we first started thinking about different ideas at the time, we had a lot of energy around online community, obviously, given our background, and thinking about areas where maybe it had been underserved. And local is the one that I think had come up a lot. And yet we had all been in the internet space long enough to have a memory of so many companies that had tried and failed along the way. And even at the time, there were probably a dozen or 2 dozen different companies out there that were trying to do this, mostly in a smaller scale way or a regional way.
Right.
And we definitely stopped and were like, oh, that's going to be hard to go build.
Yeah.
Right. But as you know, ideas come up, and sometimes they come up a little too early.
Yep.
And the market's not quite ready for them. And I think for us, the opportunity that we saw at the time was that you had Facebook for your friends and family, you had LinkedIn for your professional connections, and what about the people who lived right down the street? Why couldn't we use technology as a way to connect with them? And I think one of the things that was different and important was that people were comfortable on both Facebook and LinkedIn of using their real name and their real identity.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very important, because that was not true in the age of opinions, for example.
Right.
Building online reputation and identity at that point was much more difficult. And back in 1999, you rarely used your real name online.
Yep. People forget that when Jonathan Abrams started Friendster, the thing that people would say to him is, no one will ever put their real name online. No one will ever put a photo of themselves, which is comical now that you think that people can't stop. No one will ever put a photo of themselves. Like, that was the zeitgeist.
Right. And I think you look at that, and I remember Friendster, right? I remember trying to use it, and a lot of people in Silicon Valley were using it, and it was super interesting, but it just didn't quite catch on. And of course, what Facebook, I think, got right was nurturing it in a trusted community, your college environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of using your real name and your photo, if you're 19 years old and you're sharing it with other people at your college, that seemed comfortable. Yeah. And that was a very important insight. And for us at Nextdoor, I think part of the insight that we had was we saw that people didn't know their neighbors. So as a result, they didn't have an easy way to use their contact list as a way to connect with the people who lived around them. That created an opportunity, but it also was one of the hurdles. And I think one of the things that we got right was the idea that the neighborhood is this important social unit that people understand. And if I meet someone, I say, oh, where do you work? Where do you live? What neighborhood? And if I say to you, I live in Soma, or I live in Noe Valley, or I live in Oakland, or I live in, fill in the blank of the neighborhood, with that comes some identity.
Yep.
People identify with their neighborhood. And so I think part of what we figured out was the way to really crack local was to start with the neighborhood, because it was a real world community that people understood. And then the second thing that I think we figured out was that the address was a way to unlock and introduce you to the people who lived around you.
Right.
And so everything that we built was on this geospatial layer, which is just a fancy name for a map. And we could then connect people and say, all right, within this neighborhood boundary, these 100 households all are within the boundary, and therefore they're a part of this community. And that community has a name that people identify with. Those were things that actually made sense to real neighbors. I think this is really important. I think something like Nextdoor was something that, frankly, when I would talk about it with fellow entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, they'd scratch their head and say, well, wait a minute, like, why don't you just use zip code and it's within, a mile radius of where you live? And can't I just roll my own? And can I use Google Circles for that? I mean, everything came up. It's like, you can, but most people won't. And when we went and talked to people in Loudon, Tennessee, or Peoria, Illinois, they're like, oh, I get it. It's a way for me to talk to my neighbors. Like, it wasn't a hard leap for them to get. But actually in Silicon Valley, where technology is everywhere, they wanted to complicate things. And we were lucky enough to actually talk to people across the country and get a much better sense of how real Americans thought about their neighborhoods and their neighborhood community and their desire to connect and converse with them.
So how did you figure out it was worth doing? Like at the very beginning, did you talk to people in Tennessee and say, hey, did you know you need this thing? Or like, how'd that get going?
It's a great question. And a lot of it was informed by the failure of our previous company, Fanbase. So where we spent 18 months kind of locked in a room, not telling anyone what we were working on, we took a radically different approach with Nextdoor. And frankly, we were humbled by the experience with Fanbase. And we're testing and validating things to confirm our own biases that we were having. And so for us, what we did in the early stages, and meanwhile, we had 2 or 3 other ideas that we were working on simultaneously. So it's like survival of the fittest that was happening here. And we actually went out. I remember doing about 12 or 15 interviews with different neighborhood leaders about the idea and the concept that became Nextdoor. And those were people in the Bay Area, but they were also people in other parts of the country, really anyone who we could get in touch with. And at that point, we established there was some interest in the idea. Then we built very simple wireframes and mock-ups. Frankly, they were super ugly because we had no designer on staff. We showed them to people and we got a ton of feedback. And frankly, the idea of Nextdoor changed pretty dramatically in those early stages before we ever wrote a line of code. And thankfully, it's probably saved us from years of going down the wrong path and frankly, probably losing faith in what it was that we were trying to build. And through that, we started to hear the same things as we talked to people across the country about the ideas that we had. And at that point, we said we have to build a simple prototype. That prototype was actually launched in the Bay Area with one neighborhood in Menlo Park, and it worked. Yeah. People wanted to talk to their neighbors, but we were very cautious and said, okay, that's not enough. Let's try one in Seattle, Washington. We had one in upstate rural New York. We had one outside of Washington, D.C., one in Loudon, Tennessee. And we just started to see how people were using the platform. And that gave us the confidence after we did about 5 of those. We said, okay, this is the winning idea, and we're going to double down on it.
Was there something was there something people wanted to talk about? Like, was it, we think they're going to talk about something, I don't know. But it turns out there's this completely weird other use case that you found.
So when we were in the wireframe stage, we had a high-minded idea that people would want to engage in civic conversations about ballot topics, for example. Mm-hmm. And even in the wireframe stage, as we describe that, they go, yeah, maybe. But what I really want is I want to find a bookcase from someone's basement. I want a name of a great babysitter. I want to get together with my neighbors to clean up the local park, and I just want to communicate with them about everyday things. And that led to a pretty dramatic shift on how we focused the early product. But we were very careful not to be prescriptive as people got onto the platform. There were no categories in the beginning of Nextdoor. And yet, if you go back and you look at the first 5 or 6 conversations that come up in the neighborhood, that first neighborhood, what you get is someone looking for a lost package, someone looking for a recommendation for an exterminator, someone looking for a tutor for one of their kids. Yeah. Someone was looking for a piece of felt for a Halloween costume, and a group was trying to organize a parade of the kids for Halloween. And it's like the use cases presented themselves right off the bat.
Right.
Now, we validated that in more neighborhoods across the country, but there was a consistency across the board. And I think a lot of that was obvious to us because we were so hands-on in the beginning.
Yeah.
This wasn't like a large-scale test. I was on the phone with a lot of these users. Folks on the team were hand-drawing neighborhood boundaries and talking to people and trying to figure out how do we eventually automate this. But in the beginning, it was very manual. Right. It was the type of stuff that all seemed non-scalable, and everyone kind of thought we were crazy to do it that way. But to me, that was the only way to come up with innovative insights about how to solve this problem that, as you mentioned, for years had seemed insurmountable, to build a hyper-local social network across the country and frankly around the globe.
And how did you solve the kind of cold start, the problem that Facebook never had, because 90% of a college would be on it within 2 days? But one guy shows up, says this is great. There's not another person. They post something, they don't get a response, and they're like, this sucks, and they're gone. Like,
we obsessed about this from the very beginning. It was probably our biggest fear because we were folks that understood how online communities worked, right? The empty bar problem that you described right. is really, really bad. And in fact, it can lead to people getting turned off from the idea. And so in the beginning, we did non-scalable things, like we would send emails to encourage the founding member who had started the neighborhood to invite other people and get conversations started. And after doing that enough, you start to learn what are the nudges that get people going. And I think one of the things that we got right was creating a sense that you could create a person could create a neighborhood, but you needed to have a local champion who was going to raise their hand and be the one that brings it to the community. It couldn't be me as an employee of Nextdoor saying, we're going to go launch a neighborhood, in out in Long Island. Someone would be like, who are you and what are you doing, right? You needed someone from that community to raise their hand and say, I want to bring Nextdoor to my neighborhood. And so with that, we encourage people, they had to apply to bring it to their neighborhood. They had to give the neighborhood a name and draw the boundaries, which not everyone could do. And then they were asked to invite their fellow neighbors. And they had 21 days to get 9 other people to sign up and verify that they lived in the neighborhood. And if they did not, we would expire the neighborhood and give someone else a chance to do it.
Interesting.
And so there was this time deadline, a constraint, and a sense that we're going to take this away from you if you don't, move it along and get the word out into your community. But more importantly, it allowed us to find the person in the neighborhood who was going to be a good advocate for getting this off the ground. Yeah. Right. So, and it also helped us figure out, are the boundaries correct? Is the name correct? All of those pieces were crowdsourced from the ground up. And I think the added benefit that you had is that you had someone on the ground in the community who felt some ownership for getting the neighborhood off the ground.
Right. So as it starts growing, what is the sort of negative? Social networks seem to have sort of dissonances that you have to put in systems to fight. So, for example, on LinkedIn, 1 million people want to meet Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman doesn't want to meet 1 million people. The famous person gets too much attention. And like Facebook, people post a lot of porn, and Facebook has a lot of systems to stop them from doing that. Was there something on Nextdoor that sort of became, if we don't get this thing under control once you were successful, we're going to have trouble?
Yeah, I think in the early days, we had some people who wanted to get onto the platform and name the neighborhood and get it created for their own personal use. The classic example of this would be a local service provider or like a real estate agent, and they would name the neighborhood like Mary's neighborhood. Right. Yeah, and so we had to do things to make sure that that was not rewarded behavior. And as I mentioned, the pilot process that we created was one of them, because it turns out that your neighbors don't want to join Mary's neighborhood. They want to join a neighborhood that has a name that they recognize that they would describe to somebody else.
Yeah, that actually does work. I'm in like the West Mission neighborhood of San Francisco, which is somewhat awkwardly named, but it's actually the right thing.
Right. And we actually thought a lot about making the neighborhoods smaller than you might think of for real estate purposes. So the mission is really large.
Yes.
It's frankly too big. And so how do you come up with a name? And that's where we started to say, okay, you may not normally refer to it as West Mission, but if I say West Mission, you understand what that means and kind of, oh yeah, that makes sense. I do live in West Mission.
Yeah, and the issues, the streets or the thing that's going to get put in or whatever do relate to us and do not relate to people on the other side of the mission.
That's correct.
So when did you realize, I feel like Nextdoor started slowly. By the way, LinkedIn, people forget this. LinkedIn was kind of dead for a long
the overnight
years.
Success that took 8 years.
I remember I was one of the first people on LinkedIn because I knew, Reid Hoffman, and then it was fine. And then about 2 or 3 years in, every other day I would get, maybe someone there figured something out, but suddenly every other day I would be getting a LinkedIn request. But I'd been on it for 2 years. So was there a point for Nextdoor when all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, we know it. We knew it was working, but now this thing's, on its way to $2 billion where it is today in terms of value?
We drew a lot of inspiration from LinkedIn. And in fact, one of the investors that we brought on board relatively early on, but not right in the beginning, was Greylock, and in particular, David Z, who had been the lead investor for Greylock into LinkedIn. So he understood how these networks kind of evolved and how they were built. And knowing Reed, you knew that if you build it the right way, you're going to build something that has lasting value. And so we were willing to be patient and build Nextdoor the right way, because we understood that once you got neighbors talking to each other and then connecting them to adjacent neighborhoods, that you could build something really, really powerful. But you couldn't just do it overnight. In fact, if you remember going through the sign up flow for Nextdoor, you have to verify your address before you get access to it. Right. So there's a fair amount of friction that a lot of people are like, oh, let's get rid of that. And it's like, well, actually, what we're building here is a platform built on trust and identity.
Well, there were postcards, right? Like, wasn't there physical, like wasn't there some piece of mail that you could get in, which I thought this was genius, by the way. Would you get it in your mailbox and that's how you would
That was one way that we could verify that you actually lived at a set address. And so we created many ways that you could do that, but at the very least, we could send you a postcard and get you to verify that way. But I think for us, we were just looking at this as saying, it's going to take time to get these neighborhoods off the ground, and we've got to grow them and make sure that they're conversations. People talk about liquidity of content on a platform. We thought a lot about that, but we also recognized that authenticity and trust was very, very important on the platform, and you couldn't rush that.
Yeah. So now it becomes successful. Once again, you find yourself and this time it's your company though. Was that obviously that was different from the eBay Microsoft experience, but why not stay there forever and take it public? And
I'm incredibly proud of what we built at Nextdoor, and in many respects, like my DNA is all over that, and my heart and soul went into that. And the company had gone from being an idea, and you said at the beginning of the show, like it's something that people know, it's a household name, and that warms my heart, because I remember when it was not, and when people thought it was crazy, like, wow, doesn't this exist someplace else? And why do I want to talk to my neighbors? And when you see some of the things that happen around COVID, and people are turning to one another and saying, of course I want to know what's happening in my neighborhood. So it was incredibly rewarding to see us go from zero to then being used by tens of millions of people in 11 different countries. I spent the last 2 or 3 years at Nextdoor going around the globe and getting Nextdoor off the ground in places like France and Italy and Spain and Australia and on down the line. And that was incredibly rewarding. I think for me, there just came a point where I wanted to step back and say, hey, is this what I want to be doing for the next 3 or 4 years? And as we brought in a new CEO in Sarah Fryer, it felt like that was a natural time to step back and say, do I want to sign up for another tour of duty? Fortunately, I'm still involved as a board observer and get to play a role of helping guide things from a different vantage point. And it felt like it was an opportunity for me to get back to that early stage company building and take the experiences that I had, whether it was at Opinions or Fanbase or Nextdoor, and try and apply it in a different way to help other entrepreneurs hopefully go through the journey and see around a few corners and hopefully increase the odds of success.
And as COVID hit, how did I had Rob Chestnut on, who's the general counsel for Airbnb, and they obviously were very specifically affected by COVID. Was there anything Nextdoor? Here's what I did on Nextdoor. We have a puppy, like a new puppy.
Yes.
And we were like, thank you. It's a very high energy 6-month-old cattle dog. And we were like, this dog's not meeting other dogs because everyone's on the street and they're kind of social distancing. So we went on Nextdoor and said, we have a backyard. Is there anybody out there with a dog that's about this size and energy who wants to come play with our dog? Then we met somebody on Nextdoor who has a dog. They also want to socialize and they come over. So that was our COVID use of Nextdoor.
That's fantastic. We're seeing that across the country and frankly around the globe as people were asked to shelter in place and hunker down. Their awareness of their local neighborhood, of their community, and their need to rely on one another to get help and services. And that's everything from, can someone help me go get medicine or groceries, to, hey, I want to go walk my dog. Can someone, who else is walking their dog at the same time? And I think what's interesting, much like what you said with LinkedIn, is that over the course of the last 10 years, as we were building out these neighborhood networks across the country, now covering virtually every single neighborhood in the United States, when something like a pandemic happens, all of a sudden you're like, where can I get information about what's happening locally? Mm-hmm. And what we saw was that engagement just skyrocketed. And part of it was because you could get information from your neighbors about what was happening. But there's another part of it that Nextdoor, for years, we have partnered with local agencies, right? The mayor's office, neighborhood services, these local health officials. And we started to bring in their content, highlighting them, so you knew that you were getting real information, not misinformation, about what was happening with COVID in your local community. And a lot of what Nextdoor is about that highly relevant local community information that is proximate to where you live. Yeah. And frankly, we have seen this over the years. When there's a hurricane that hits a place like Houston, like what we saw with Hurricane Harvey, the way that the Office of Emergency Management was using Nextdoor to send out very targeted information to different parts of Houston. If you know Houston well, you know it's a huge landmass. Yeah. And so what you're telling someone down in the southeast corner of Houston versus the Woodlands is very, very different. But because there was a platform that was geo-specific, you could send out very targeted information. And so we just saw that supercharged during COVID, and frankly saw how neighbors came together to look out for one another and help one another during what has remained a very challenging time.
Yeah, that's a nice story in all of that. What you've become a venture capitalist now. What's the plan here? You didn't join Greylock or a big firm. You kind of joined a newer firm, or what's your strategy here?
Sure. So I was very lucky along the way with many of the investors I came across to see folks that could be very helpful in building a company. And what I wanted to do as an investor was to make sure that I was in a place that put a lot of emphasis in partnering with entrepreneurs to help them through that journey, especially that early stage. And so I was talking with a friend of mine who knows a lot of VCs because he's an LP in a lot of them. And as I told him about my journey at Nextdoor, and in particular the journey to find product market fit, he said, you really should talk to the guys over at Unusual Ventures, and John Veronis in particular, because he has built a firm from the ground up thinking about this. And so I was really drawn to an earlier stage venture firm that was building from the ground up with an idea to partner with entrepreneurs in this journey and to be a part of building that firm from the ground up. I think there's a theme in there. I like building things. Yep. And as I got there and got to know John better and reconnected with Andy Johns, I said, wow, these are folks that are interested in really being a partner to the founders in their journey. And that's what I was interested in, is to take my experiences and hopefully be able to share them with founders as they go through those early stages and avoid the mistakes that we made with Fanbase, and hopefully follow more of the path of the good things that we did with Nextdoor. And I think that there are explicit lessons that you can take out of that hopefully I can share with entrepreneurs on their journey.
We've kind of figured this out recently, that most VCs, and there are notable exceptions, aren't entrepreneurs. If you write down a list of 10, as we talk to LPs, they're surprised. We give them this thought experiment. We're like, write down 10 VCs. And what did they do? They were either professional investors or they worked at Google, which was once a startup, but it's kind of a false syllogism that they worked at a startup. They worked at a 40,000 person company. So many VCs have never actually done the thing. Andreessen Horowitz have, obviously Reid Hoffman has, but you have not done the actual thing of starting something from scratch, firing half the team, pivoting, getting your money back, grinding it out in Houston or wherever. It's interesting. Doesn't mean you can't be good. You do it the other way.
There's different ways to approach it. I think the way that makes sense for me is to share my experiences, and what I have found in my conversations with founders is they light up. They're like, "Oh my goodness, this is so helpful." And what they want from you is not just money and capital, but they want sage advice and insight, and frankly, a little compassion to know what's it like to sit in that hot seat.
That's right.
And so that's the way that I've approached it. Obviously, there are many other ways to go about being successful in investing, but I wanted to be in a place where the firm was really designed from the ground up to think about how do we help entrepreneurs. And I don't know how much you know about Unusual Ventures, but from the mix of the people that are at the firm to the resources, like there's an entire field guide on how to go through each of the various steps, whether you're a consumer or an enterprise company, like that we freely give out and share the advice. We have an internal team that's the Get Ahead group, and that group is experts in recruiting and building out a sales channel and thinking about different ways that you can grow the business, thinking about the product marketing questions that you have. We approach things differently and really take that hands-on approach, which I think for early stage founders and entrepreneurs can be a great mix. And so we look for entrepreneurs who want a partner and not just have someone write a check and not talk to them for months or years.
Well, on that note, we can wrap up with this. How does an entrepreneur or anybody, people all over the world listen to this, but entrepreneurs follow you or Unusual, like Twitter, or what?
Twitter is a great place to go. At Sarah Leary is a good place to go. You can also email me, sarah@unusual.vc. You can follow Unusual on Twitter, LinkedIn, and definitely go check out the unusual.vc website. There's an incredible host of information out there that will be helpful for entrepreneurs wherever they are in the process. And we look forward to hearing from people who are working on exciting ideas. I'm primarily focused on the consumer side of companies, but we also do a lot on the enterprise side. So hopefully we'll hear from some of those entrepreneurs that are early in the journey and are looking for a partner that's not afraid to roll up their sleeves and work alongside and help you out.
All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Kent. It's been a real pleasure and great to see you.
All right. This is the Something Measured podcast. Sarah Leary is my guest. Talk to you next time.